And I'm going to pick up on something that he closed with, which is this idea of conscious participation and conscious experimentation. And I don't know the person's name who asked the last question, but I appreciated the question and the statement enormously because I thought that within your question was a greatly valuable point, which is that we are faced today with these possibilities of virtual sex or the changing of one's physicality in ways that maybe our ancestors couldn't have imagined. And these things can be extraordinary, and I think they can be tonic to the human spirit, if I can put it in such a way. There are biological relationships, for example, that are not made to fit all of our lives, are not perfect for all of our lives. And if someone replicates a biological relationship, either sexually or relationally through friendships with others in a strictly digital domain or what have you, they might be able to find new mediums that are extraordinarily helpful to them and that enrich their lives almost beyond measure and that improve their sense of personal power. There's, of course, the dark side to all this, which Doug was alluding to as well, which is rather than playing the instrument begins to play us, which is kind of the grotesque flip side of all this technology and our pursuit of personal utopias. I had a funny experience a few days ago on Twitter where we're remodeling our kitchen at home, another tactile experience, and I had a bunch of hoodoo candles in the kitchen, sacred devotional candles to different African gods and deities and saints, and my wife said to me, "What do you want to do with this stuff?" And I said to her, "That stuff is immensely valuable to me," and I posted pictures of it in her comment on Twitter, and almost immediately I got messaged by a cabinet contractor wanting to know if we wanted an estimate on cabinets for our new kitchen. You know, it wasn't the point of my post, and it was funny, you know, in the year 2018. I'm not sure if that's going to be funny in the year 2028. I'm not sure that's going to be funny at all. You know, we may get very harried and hounded and feel like our privacy has been compromised in ways that we can't even begin to imagine today. So there's a utopian, dystopian side to all of this, as in all things in life. But the thing that I really want to talk to you, following on what Doug was saying about conscious experimentation, is that I think we need to cultivate a great sense of limitlessness in our conscious experimentation, rather than just kind of falling into things or accepting things because of peer opinion, which can be very pernicious. I would encourage you to take a fresh look at things that seem particularly old or musty or no longer useful. There has to be a third thing knocked down. I insist upon it, or no longer useful. One of the technologies, in a certain sense, that has been almost unique in a way to America over the past 200 years, that found its primary rootedness here and that America exported to the rest of the world, has been what you might call a kind of spiritual technology. Americans inquired long ago from many different walks of life, going back to the colonial era, whether spirituality itself could be rendered into some sort of a technology that would give its user predictable and reliable results. This sometimes gets expressed today in the form of what we call the prosperity gospel, or prayer healing, or the law of attraction, or the power of positive thinking. Ideas that serious people are supposed to not take seriously. Ideas that I'm supposed to stand up here at a gallery in Chelsea and talk about with despair, as if to say these things signal the withering of our seriousness. These things have been co-opted by corporations that want you to be a good little gerbil spinning around in your wheel inside your cubicle. These things represent a decline of the American psyche. I break with all that. I absolutely break with all that. You can read those points of view everywhere. I sometimes debate people who proffer those points of view, which are very common. There's been a kind of intellectual vogue, probably since the 1950s, in treating concepts like the law of attraction or the power of positive thinking as the ultimate philosophy for dummies, as a philosophy that saps the individual of his or her capacity for critical thought and stoicism and engagement with the grit and problems of day-to-day life. I'm very aware of that critique. It has been articulated in an artful and sometimes very persuasive way for decades and decades. But I break with it. I break with it. Because I also think that counter to that critique, there has been amassed in our culture, in places where serious people are discouraged from looking, a testimony of experience that I think captures something of the tactile reality that Doug was talking about, and that captures the private experiments of individuals tracked over a period of generations, which over the course of time form a record. And I became very interested in these philosophies. Questions of whether the mind has causative abilities, whether and under what circumstances prayer and directed thoughts and visualizations and affirmations change or augment the individual's experience, which of course could all be attributed to a kind of confirmation bias. And yet, the record of testimony goes on, and I began to ask myself, what if the experts who have studied this and critiqued it for these many decades themselves need to be critiqued? How do I know that their point of view is correct, that these things are foolish ideas that should have been left behind with whale oil lamps or whalebone corsets? What if there's a whole occult narrative that exists like a kind of underground river above the mainstream critique that has been neglected, that has not been reviewed, looked at, understood? I was influenced when I was growing up by a spiritual teacher that some of you have probably heard of named Jiddu Krishnamurti, who came out of the Vedic tradition, but really was a very unclassifiable voice. And Krishnamurti made the point that the greatest impediment to self-development, the greatest impediment to individual happiness and to intellectual dynamism is the wish for respectability. Nothing stunts more personal experiments and inquiry than the certainty that the compass point of respectability is pointing this way, and therefore this way I must go. And talk about confirmation bias. Once you have fixed on that compass point of where respectability lies, everything that you encounter, that you read, that you hear will affirm that direction for you. It's human nature. It's one of the great pitfalls of human nature that makes independent inquiry quite difficult. But I was inspired by this statement of Krishnamurti's about the manner in which seeking respectability limits the individual. And in being influenced by that principle, I decided to ask myself as a historian, what if I were to turn the pages backward on this American effort to arrive at a utopia of the mind, at this American effort to create a kind of spiritual technology? And what if, in turning the pages backward, I were side by side to read and to experience critiques that sought to reinforce the mainstream view, which is important and sometimes correct, in my view, but also to look at some of these events without being weighted down by the preconceptions of exactly the manner in which I was educated, without accepting the various opinion-making literature that has amassed around occult history, and said to myself, how do I know? How do I know what's there? How do I know what I'm going to find if I peel back the onion? So what if there's a news piece that runs in the Atlantic Monthly or on NPR about a placebo study? Why shouldn't I go and read the placebo study myself? So what if some valid source of opinion, like the New York Times Magazine, reports on the state of ESP research on college campuses? Why shouldn't I read those reports myself? Why shouldn't I struggle through the statistical analysis myself? And if I can't understand the statistical analysis, find someone who can help me to understand it. Why should I be the recipient of journalistic or polemical assessments of some of the ideas around spiritual history, claims of non-physical phenomena, rather than look at these things myself without being dragged toward that compass point of respectability? Now, I said this is a very American idea, that the mind has these causative properties and that we can harness some sort of extra physical capacities, whether through prayer or through the direction of thought, to accomplish things. But that idea has been around for a long time in various forms. In Paradise Lost, John Milton wrote, "The mind is a place unto itself. It can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven." That observation was put in the mouth of Lucifer, interestingly enough. Satan is an optimist. And yet it was in the early days of this country that people took that idea to heart in this very literal fashion. And we're still coping with it today, but in a kind of covert way, because it can't be spoken of. It has to be couched in other kinds of queries, like the Center for Placebo Studies at Harvard University. Here's 3 interesting bits of history. I would say lost history in a certain sense. These 3 interesting bits are all connected and might give us a little bit of a different sense of who we are and precisely where we come from. And I hope they may touch 1 or 2 people here to commence with certain experiments, which I'll say a concluding word about. In the years just immediately preceding the French Revolution, there was a Swiss-Viennese lawyer and self-styled healer, who many of you have probably heard of, named Franz Anton Mesmer, who showed up in Paris, where he became a sensation in royal courts and in the homes of aristocrats. And he made the claim that all of life was animated by this invisible etheric fluid that he called animal magnetism. And Mesmer said that if he placed you into some sort of a trance state, which today we would call a hypnotic trance, he could, through various measures and methods, manipulate your animal magnetism and cure you of all kinds of physical ailments, diseases, emotional disorders, and so on. And Mesmer became a great sensation, and he was particularly popular among the aristocracy, which was unaware that it would soon have much, much greater problems to deal with. And he was also popular among early French revolutionaries because they were very turned on by this idea that if all of life were animated by this invisible etheric fluid, this animal magnetism, that means all individuals are essentially equal regardless of social rank. We are all capillaries of one form or another for Mesmer's animal magnetism. And early abolitionists were also very aroused by this idea because they thought, well, wait a minute. If a nobleman and a person living in slavery in the West Indies can both be put into some sort of mesmeric trance, and they both seem to display the same physical capacities, and the mesmerists can manipulate them and reportedly cure them of illnesses and so forth, then it said something about the essential equality of the human situation. And this was where Mesmer began to get in trouble. And King Louis XVI felt that an end needed to be put to mesmerism, and he appointed a royal commission to investigate Mesmer. And his commission actually was chaired by Benjamin Franklin, who at the time was the U.S.'s new ambassador to France. And the Franklin Commission, as it was sometimes called, said, well, you know, look, we've researched this guy, and we have found that when people are placed under some sort of a mesmeric trance, there have been some cases of reported cures. There have been certain physical manifestations. Sometimes bleeding starts, sometimes bleeding stops. And they talked about some of the physical correlations to the trance state, but they concluded that it was all in the imagination. It was all in the imagination. And that was, largely speaking, the end of the Franklin report, but it left dangling its most tantalizing question, which was that if it was all in the imagination, why should there be any effects registered at all? What is the imagination? You know, today we love talking about the idea of conscious machines. I wouldn't venture to define consciousness because we can't even settle, although materialists would insist I'm incorrect, we can't even settle on the question of whether consciousness or the mind, to put it in a plainer way, is a localized phenomenon strictly to gray matter or whether there is something else going on. Of course, again, if you read the top 5 Google results, there's no reason to even consider that there could be anything non-localized about intelligence. And yet, people who are studying these things, whether in particle mechanics or other fields, find that the question deepens and deepens and deepens. That's just one manner in which we can't even define the consciousness that Google hopes it's going to create. What are they creating? The Franklin Commission's question, left dangling, left unaddressed, is a question that continues, if we let it, to haunt us to this day. Why should there be any effects whatsoever associated with the imagination? Flash forward to the early 20th century. Mesmerism had its ups and downs. It became popular, unpopular, popular again in Europe, in the United States, etc. There was a French druggist who was living in northwestern France in the town of Troyes named Emile Coué. Yeah, Letitia's happy. We got Emile Coué in. And Coué was a druggist and an amateur hypnotist. By the early 20th century, what had previously been called mesmerism was now called hypnotism, a name given to it by a Scottish physician named James Braid. And Coué liked to try little experiments in his druggist shop. And one of the things that Coué did was he discovered, at least anecdotally, that when he spoke in praise of a certain medication that he was giving out to his clients in this little town, it seemed to him that they reported more efficacious results from the medication if he had spoken of its praise. Those patients of his to whom he spoke in praise of a medication seemed to do better with the formula that he was dispensing. He made note of this. It informed a lot of his career. Some of you may not have heard of Emile Coué, but I guarantee you've heard of his signature achievement, which is this. In the early 1920s, he became famous for prescribing to people the affirmation, day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. And this was, of course, ridiculed throughout the opinion-making press. H.L. Mencken practically would burst a gasket over such things, and Coué's name was soon made into a kind of slang word, and he was regarded as this sort of shallow, simplistic figure who seemed to capture everything that was unsound about the Jazz Age. How could people believe this French druggist with his ridiculous little mantra, day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. For those of you who are interested, by the way, just a little side note, if you want to experiment with Coué's mantra, if there are any aspiring Couéists in here, I'll tell you exactly how to do it, because this is how he prescribed it. Why don't you try it? Then you can email me, tell me what happens. The way Coué prescribed using his little mantra was exactly this. He said that you must use it just as you're drifting off to sleep at night, just when you're hovering in that very relaxed state between wakefulness and sleep, which today we call the hypnagogic state, which is a very remarkable state of mind. It's kind of like when your mind is like a Salvador Dali painting. You have sensory awareness, and you have just enough kind of intellectual presence to distinguish between what's real and what's not, but your mind is in kind of a hallucinogenic state. It's a very supple state, hypnagogic state. Coué didn't use that term came later. But Coué said, just as you're falling asleep at night, whisper gently to yourself 20 times, day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better, 20 times. And he didn't want you to rouse yourself from your very relaxed state, from your near sleep state. So he said, here's what you do. You take a little string or a thread, and you knot it 20 times, like a rosary. And you use this to count off your recitations of the mantra. You're using it so that you're not consciously trying to count and inadvertently awakening yourself. And then he said, just when you wake up in the morning again, which is a state that's sometimes called hypnopompia, but it's basically the same state, I think. It's this exquisitely relaxed state. You're physically very relaxed, you're warm, you're under the covers, you're praying, oh, don't let the alarm clock go off. Let me roll over and it'll say 5 a.m., It's that wonderful, wonderful, exquisitely relaxed state. Your mind's very supple, bending. You hear things, you internally see things. You know they're not real. Maybe you're enjoying them. It's almost like a Disney ride. Again, just as you're coming to in the morning, you take out your little string again, your knotted string. You whisper to yourself, audibly, your mantra, day by day in every way, I'm getting better and better. And Coué said this could reprogram the mind. He was inspired in part by his experiments as a druggist. The suggestions that he could make to people that they would believe seemed to have a concrete effect on their circumstance. And of course, you hear this little mantra and you think, that sounds ridiculous. I'm not going to believe that. I hate myself. And he said, well, this is where you have to make use of this exquisitely relaxed state just before falling asleep, just when waking up. You can try it. The Beatles tried it. They liked it. You can find references to Coué in some of their songs. Getting Better All the Time is one of them. One of John Lennon's songs, Beautiful Boy, quotes Coué. Coué had a lot of followers, but his name sort of fell into disrepute rather quickly, and nobody tries his methods anymore. But this method that I've suggested to you, it's simplicity itself. It's simplicity itself. One or two of you will try it, and then email me. Tell me what happens. Find out. Find out. Maybe it's your destiny. Maybe someone here, it's your destiny to give new birth to Couéism. New birth to Couéism. Why not? Doesn't hurt anybody. So Coué's name, really, he died in 1926. He only made 2 short tours of the United States, and his name quickly became ridiculed, and he was just as quickly forgotten. Well, flash forward to our third piece of occult history. About 3 years ago, Harvard Medical School, which, as I mentioned, now has a placebo studies section, published a study, widely published in a medical journal, talked about in the media. You probably heard about it on NPR. NPR loves these stories. Anything that comes out of Harvard, NPR loves. Like, Harvard Medical School found that President Trump is a reptilian, and then, they're on it. They did a very interesting study. It was the first placebo study that was done with an actual active substance, not an inert substance, like a sugar pill, or just baking soda, just some completely inert substance that had no discernible significant physical effects. But what the researchers at Harvard Medical School did, in brief, is that they found that if people were supplied with positive information about the effects of a drug, in this case it was a migraine pill, they largely reported experiencing better relief, better effects from ingesting the substance. So again, I'm putting this very generally, but you have a control group of folk who were given the migraine pill, and on a pain scale, they report some relief, usually. And then you have a test group that's given the migraine pill, and they're supplied with positive information about the drug, and a larger fragment of that group reports better results. And they ran this test in a variety of ways. I'm sort of boiling this down in a very simple way. And the results were interesting, because what it suggested is, according to the researchers at least, that what we call the placebo effect may be at work all the time. It may be something that's affecting us all the time, not just when a group of people are given false information about an inert substance, but in fact, your expectations based upon packaging, based upon something your friend tells you, based upon something that you hear online, may be affecting you physically all the time in all kinds of ways. And they were just limiting the scope of their study to a migraine medicine. But it raised very interesting questions. And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is a clinical replication of exactly what Emile Coué was doing in northwestern France in the early 20th century. And the study had several bylines on it. I wrote to the physician who was designated to be the media spokesman to ask him, have you heard of Emile Coué? Were you thinking of any of this when you were designing your study? So of course he thinks to himself, who's this occult lunatic writing to me about Emile Coué? Ignores me completely. And I said, well, we're not going to have this. The Hasbro company can't ignore me when I write about Ouija boards. By God, Harvard will not ignore me when I write about Emile Coué. So I got in touch with a very good man named Ted Kapchuk, who is in charge of Harvard's placebo studies program. And his byline was on the study as well, although he wasn't the designated media speaker. But he's an interesting guy, and so he responded to an interesting question. And I asked him, had you thought of Coué when you were designing this study? And I described to him what Coué had done in the early 20th century in France. And he said, my God, no, we were not thinking of Coué at all when we designed this study, but it does sound like there could be some correlation between what we found clinical evidence for and what Coué described experimenting with. And he seemed sort of excited that I had even asked him, and said, of course I knew Coué, day by day in every way. I appreciated his enthusiasm, which I'm not often greeted with when I ask people questions like this. And I was touched by that. Because it seemed to me that the folks who designed that study and the people who reported on that study may never hear of the name Emile Coué. But it did seem to me that it was some clinical validation of Coué's instincts and Coué's insights from the early 20th century. And I was moved by that. I was moved by that. And I felt like this man did not experiment in vain. His instincts were in the right direction, and I think some people found genuine help and vigor and productive application of his ideas. And I've given you just one of them. Will tonight mark a rebirth of Couéism? Perhaps, yes. Perhaps it will. I invite you to forget about respectability and join me in this experiment. Don't run around telling people that you're doing it, because they'll say, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Of course they will. Of course they will. It's your experiment. If you choose to do it, keep it private. Keep it exquisitely private. Don't tell your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your spouse, because they'll say, that's so dumb, you know. Who told you that? You know, it's private. It's yours. But I think that we do have this capacity for personal agency, as I think you were alluding in your question to Doug, in the relationships and the experiments and the possibilities that we enter into. And it's so wonderful for me to be able to speak to you tonight, because we're talking about digital technology, utopia, dystopia, and there is this small cluster of people like Coué and others, who ask these questions about whether there could be a technology that harnessed these dimly understood forces that might really contribute to the betterment of the individual. That's part of the story of modern humanity's reach for utopia. It's not political. It's a technology of the mind. It's technology of individual experiment. And how wonderful it is, I think. How wonderful, I'm like Satan, I'm an optimist. How wonderful it is that everyone here in this room has the capacity to engage in these private experiments. What beautiful, beautiful little acts of revolution these things are. It's your property. It's your property to engage in these experiments, or not. It's exquisitely voluntary. And I think that is a form of technological experimentation that's available to all of us. And my injunction to you is use it. So, thank you. Thanks.
Does anybody have any questions for Mitch? I see someone back here. Let me bring the microphone. Or is there another microphone? Take this right here.
Great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, a question about history.
Yeah.
Late 1800s is the second spiritual awakening or something in America?
Well, yeah,
or the first one?
The Great Awakening.
The Great Awakening.
And
and William
farewell
James
tour.
is a scientist.
Yeah.
He and a bunch of scientists investigate thousands of seances because
Yeah.
they want to prove what's going on.
Yeah.
They see all this weird shit happening,
Right.
but decide the results were corrupted by telepathy.
Right.
And that's their conclusion,
Yeah.
to my understanding. You're the
Yeah,
historian.
yeah.
So and with all the spiritual telegraph, it
Yeah.
seemed like there was this phenomenon in America. Can you talk about what happened? Because if something was a given, if they could say seances were corrupted by telepathy, that was their baseline, was that telepathy was real.
Right. So they have an occult premise.
To start, right?
Disprove another occult premise.
Right.
Yeah.
What happened?
It's very interesting. I appreciate your asking that. I have to reply to it very, very briefly, just, the time being what it is. I mean, this could be the subject of a whole other night. Maybe next year, we can do this.
I'm in.
I think that the inquiries that James and his colleagues in the British Society for Psychical Research, American Society for Psychical Research, today these things are rendered into cartoons. You'd think these guys were just Elmer Fudd, chasing after a ghost with a shotgun. And the truth is, there has persisted It's very difficult to talk about this in brief because no one believes it. But there has persisted a slender thread of really serious, clinically valid ESP research that has gone on since William James. The dean of this research was the great psychologist J.B. Rhine from Duke University, who commenced his work in the early 1930s. J.B., who is a hero of mine, produced vast and massive amounts of statistical data demonstrating some anomalous transfer of information in a laboratory setting. And it's funny, but I was speaking with Doug about this on his Team Human podcast, and people got angry afterwards, and they said, why didn't you push back against this guy? Why don't you, kapow, give it to him with his occult fantasies and everything? And the truth is, I'd be very happy for anyone to push back. The critics, and this includes deadline journalists who have a great deal of respect for, covering breaking news is a hard job. It's a poor way to write history. You can't write history like breaking news. And deadline journalists and others, they believe, and they have no reason not to believe, the first 5 search results that they'll encounter on Google, sometimes in very persuasive places, that would just treat ESP research like absolute garbage and fantasy. And there are people I admire greatly. Some of the brightest voices on television, like Bill Maher and Rachel Maddow, for whom I have tremendous respect. This is their thought process. They've been educated that way. And again, that's where the compass needle points towards respectability. And they don't know. They simply don't know. So that research didn't go away, although it has been tremendously hampered because it's been hounded off most college campuses. There's not an ESP lab at Duke today. There's not one at Harvard. Darrell Bem from Cornell, did clinical research into ESP and was practically, turned into public enemy number 1 in the social sciences. It's very hard to get the funding, and when the clinical data is there, people tend to disbelieve it because it's been run down in very persuasive ways. But I would say that inquiry is not gone. It's almost silenced in our generation, and it'll probably get taken up again in the next generation. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Oh, that's a wonderful question. Coué said that his preferred translation. Oh, she said, does the mantra work better in French or English, Coué's mantra? And that's a great question. Coué said that his preferred translation was day by day, in every way, I am getting better and better. Sometimes you hear it every day in every way, I'm getting better and better. But Coué said the translation that he approved of was, think of the song Day by Day. Day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. So he did feel that the translation mattered. That's a great question. Yes.
Hello. Great talk. And
Thank
I
you.
was just curious about the phrase Satan is an optimist. Could you tell us where that came from and what that means exactly?
Oh, well, I'm going to be giving a talk on Satanism, actually, March 6th at Alchemist's Kitchen, not too far from here. I'm just very taken with the depiction of Satan in the first part of Paradise Lost as this very enterprising, rebellious, free-thinking force. And, the most memorable lines in the poem, inevitably, are put in the mouth of Satan or in his Hell's Angels. There's another wonderful line, better hard liberty than the easy yoke. Better hard liberty than the easy yoke. I had a friend of mine, very public figure, who fell into some public disgrace recently. I don't want to say his name. And, I didn't know what do you say to somebody like, well, better luck next time, And I sent him that line from Paradise Lost, better hard liberty than the easy yoke, which comes out of the mouth of a demon. And he wrote me back, dude, with 10 exclamation points after it. He felt better. So in not only Milton, but in other literature of the Romantics and literature of other people who sort of venerate the word experiment, there's a perspective on the satanic that I don't think our culture has understood. And that's another kind of occult aspect of our history that I want to get into. I'll do that more at Alchemist's Kitchen, but that's where I'm coming from when I make that statement. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, this gentleman had a question.
Hi.
Hey.
You mentioned earlier that what gets in the way of our development
Yeah.
is that pursuit of respectability.
Yeah.
Is it really respectability more so than the pursuit of being validated or
Yes.
liked?
That's a great question, and that's a wonderful question. I've wrestled with that myself because it's not as though I'm immune to the wish for validation. And I've worked very hard sometimes to get that validation. I mean, I've written on occult topics for some very mainstream places, and I must confess that when those bylines appear, I'm very happy, I'm very elated, because I do feel that sense of validation. I also have noticed that as I'm getting older, I pursue that less and less. I felt I needed it, perhaps at a certain point in my career, because let's face it, you know, the world is not lining up around the block to hear what a historian of the occult has to say. You know, that's not sort of the most compelling thing on people's minds at the moment. You know, what would the ancient alchemists have said about this, you know, is not the question of the day. So when I was younger, I felt a very great need for that validation. And as I get older, I feel less and less a need for it. And I've asked myself, does that represent some maturity on my part? Am I doing a better job, you know, today of adhering to that principle I announced? Or do I just feel like, well, I've eaten the golden apple, I've had that experience, and now I can cross it off? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And it's really a question for me. But I would say this, you know, I'm 52 years old today. I have no, I'm sorry, I meant today in the figurative sense. My birthday is November 23rd, but thank you. It's so nice. Is there a cake? Wheel it out. I'm presently 52 years of age, and I sent a book proposal recently to a publisher, not a proposal, it was a completed book, to a publisher that had published me before, and they were like, great, we love you, we want you to rewrite the entire thing. And I said no to their entreaty, and I brought it to another publisher for much, much, much less money, because I had finished the book, and I knew what I wanted to say, and I was at peace. I was at peace that I had done that. And so I feel that, you know, at age 52, if I were to continue reaching for that golden apple, I would have rewritten that book. I would have made it a plainer, duller, flatter sort of book, and I would have failed, you know, in a certain sense. So I'm addressing your question in a rather roundabout way. I think that the wish for validation is basic in life, and that one needs it. And maybe I've just switched my definition of validation, but I do know that if I do want validation, but if I continued to equate validation in the direction of respectability, I would have done what the larger publisher said, not gone to the smaller publisher for less money, and I think there would have been a sense of failure. So I hope that addresses your question. Thank you.
Where is Will Baker?
Oh, there's somebody over here.
Okay, one more.
Somebody by the door.
That there are experiments, not necessarily on the occult or telepathy, but you know, on the mind, on the brain. Dr. Richie Davidson, Dalai Lama, Mind and Life Institute, where they have put monks and other meditators and MRIs and all of that. So there are things going on. There is a split, of course, between Western science and these philosophies, which are widespread now in the United States also among many people, right? But there is the Mind and Life Institute, which is trying to bring the two together.
Yes, you're making a wonderful point, and that needs saying. It's not as if this is all just, you know, been shunted back with the witches in the attic. You know, there are, of course, very valid and well-known experiments going on people who practice Tibetan meditation and other modalities, and of course neuroplasticity at UCLA and other places where it's been found that repeat self-directed thoughts apparently correlate with a real veritable change in neural pathways in the brain, which in effect is a kind of mind over matter on the neurological level. So these, you know, it's not as if there's a desert out there. These experiments certainly are going on. Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.